Operation Handclasp touches down at Otuaroa Aerodrome on the first stages of the New Zealand Goodwill mission by the American Far East Air Force. Air refueling is a great step in solving the problems of long-distance flying. The American Air Force has indeed demonstrated that it's only a handclasp that separates our countries. At Kuala Lumpur, the officer commanding the Special Air Service New Zealand Squadron, Major Frank Rennie, briefs Corporal Huia Woods for a forthcoming jungle patrol. They're going in to search for terrorist hideouts, and in the hand, equipment to speak the only kind of language that can answer terrorism. They move silently, with no badges of rank or insignia, days on end, ever on guard, trying to be as invisible as possible, to see before they're seen and shoot before they're shot at.
The Royal New Zealand Air Force represents a small country, but it stands as a senior partner in the defence of the Commonwealth.
These are no ordinary sightseers, they're Kiwis, SAS and RNZAF personnel recently stationed in Thailand with United States troops to avert trouble on the Laos border. Carried out as a joint SAS-United States exercise, these patrols simulate combat conditions. If the Cold War in the area warms up, these highly trained New Zealand paratroopers will act as a guerrilla unit behind enemy lines.
Our defence is based on collective security, which means fighting alongside our allies when necessary. New Zealand soldiers are doing this in Vietnam.
And after a meal, a letter from home really makes the day. A surprise visit by General William C. Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in South Vietnam, catches everyone a little off guard, but the uneasiness of having such a high-ranking officer around soon disappears. With the Americans camped only a few yards away, the artillerymen are soon swapping notes. Although also 105mm, the American guns cannot be transported to another location swiftly. This is where the New Zealand howitzers have a tremendous advantage.
When the New Zealand government decided to support the US intervention in Vietnam, they had to have some justification for what they were doing. And the old domino theory, that of the red bogey, was hauled out as usual. This time it was Communist China.
In Asia, our troops meet revolutionary warfare. The army has ingenious means to prepare them.
The importance of studying this type of warfare is now underlined by the fact that for the first time we are committed in terms of ground troops to the mainland of Southeast Asia. Now Mao Zedong will need no introduction, and he's assisted by General Giat, who directed the Viet Minh operation so effectively in the Indochina War.
The two experts outline the stages of communist subversion. They show the recruits how the local administration of an area can be gradually undercut until the infiltrators hold complete control. They paint a frightening picture of the certainty and deliberation of communist strategy, and there's no laughter from their audience as they detail the destruction of a nation.
You know, you don't always win. What about Malaya and the Philippines, for example?
Colonel, what about our successes? What about mainland China? What about Cuba? What about North Vietnam, and in the very near future, South Vietnam, and shortly after that, you keep your eyes on Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaya. Please face facts. You can't win. What I would like you to do, and what I'm sure you will do here in New Zealand, is to just sit here patiently and wait for us, and we will come to you.
The most powerful and influential nation in Asia, China, dominates Asian and Pacific defense strategy. this restless giant of 750 millions must seek to expand.
But the New Zealand government hadn't recognised or hadn't realised just the level of protest that would develop against their decision to send New Zealand troops. At first, the demands were very much stop the war, withdraw New Zealand troops. But as events developed in Vietnam, and with a considerable amount of education by the protest movement itself, New Zealand people began to see the real nature of the war, so that the demands were added to very much by withdraw all US troops out of Vietnam, as well as slogans for supporting the liberation struggle for independence of the Vietnamese people. The United States government was absolutely determined that there would be no cracks in the alliance. So particularly during 1966 and 1967, they sent out a number of presidential envoys to New Zealand to make sure that the pressure was still on the New Zealand government.
Mr. Hubert Humphrey, the Vice President of the United States, arrives just 48 hours later amid demonstrators and counter-demonstrators. Accompanied by Mr. Averill Harriman, America's roving ambassador, they're here to acquaint Cabinet with the results of the talks in Hawaii between their president and the leaders of South Vietnam, along with other world problems.
At the same time, US warships began appearing in New Zealand harbours. This was to put pressure on the government, but really mostly to impress New Zealand people with the rightness of the American cause in Vietnam. The main visitor to New Zealand, I suppose you would say, during that year was Johnson himself in October 1966.
It's obvious that the overcast, showery weather has not dampened the enthusiasm of the crowd present to say hello to President and Mrs. Johnson as they start a whirlwind 24-hour visit to New Zealand. The first President of the United States of America ever to visit this country, he is greeted by the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Keith Holyoake. The President is challenged and welcomed in the traditional way by a Maori party specially dressed for the occasion.
The New Zealand government pulled out all the stops to make sure that the New Zealand people were aware that we were all the way with LBJ, if you like. The schools were shut, tremendous publicity was put out to get people out onto the streets. But the protest movement mounted massive demonstrations at the time of his visit to show just where thousands of New Zealanders stood on the whole question of this war.
Mr. President, you mentioned yesterday that on many occasions we, the people of New Zealand, the people of the United States, have been joined together and engaged together in the defense of freedom.
The President of the United States, Mr. Lyndon Johnson.
Our two nations are separated by 6,000 miles of the blue Pacific Ocean, but we're united by historical interests and commitments that we think are far more important in the shaping of our national destinies than in the miles that divide us. All I want to do is not only to be the possessor of freedom and liberty, but I want to be the protector of it, not just for myself, but for mankind.
In 1967, two other presidential envoys came out to New Zealand, Clark Clifford and Maxwell Taylor, with the express purpose of trying to get the New Zealand government to increase its military commitment in Vietnam. It is very interesting because when Clark Clifford was up in Parliament buildings there behind us and looked out the window and saw thousands of people who demanded that the US and New Zealand forces and others get out of Vietnam, He wrote in his memoirs a couple of years later that he was puzzled, concerned, and very troubled at what he'd seen, and he realized that he was not going to get any more troops from New Zealand. He didn't. So I think we can really say that the protest movement had a tremendous influence in making sure that at least only a token force from New Zealand ever went to Vietnam.
Although the United States lost the war in Vietnam, there's been no significant change in so much as they've moved out of Asia, but have established bases in the islands along the Asian hinterland, stretching from Japan, Korea, the northwest Pacific, like the Philippines, down through into Australia and New Zealand, as well as the military bases established in these islands. The treaties that they have been forced to enter into with the states are the legal documents binding them to assist the Americans in their aggressive, expansionist foreign policies in the Asian and Pacific area.
According to the treaty that has been negotiated, but it has not been ratified because our people have refused to ratify it. It is called the Compact of Free Association. The treaty gives United States rights to invite armed forces from any other countries to use our islands for military training, and to use a part of our islands for to store their nuclear weapons.
New Zealand's role hasn't changed all that much from its involvement in the days of the Vietnam War. In fact, it seems to have intensified through mutual assistance programs. New Zealand soldiers are still training in fighting guerrilla campaigns in the Asian and Pacific Islands, and as such, they assist the United States in upholding the existence of repressive regimes in some of those Pacific territories, such as the Philippines.
The United States has, in many instances, been inviting the New Zealand armed forces, to train in its so-called Cope Thunder exercises, as well as the Spec Warex, or special warfare exercises that are being regularly held on Philippine territory. Also, Filipino armed forces personnel in their significant numbers, and most of these have been Philippine pilots, have been trained by the New Zealand government to strafe and bomb populations in the Philippines. The Philippine government at present is having a hard time trying to contain what it refers to as a communist insurgency in the Philippines. However, this so-called communist insurgency, which the U.S. governments and the Philippine governments refer to, is actually a broad opposition front by the people of the Philippines to establish and to have meaningful changes in Philippine society. And we in the Philippines are afraid that if this civil war escalates and goes out of hand, from the point of view of the Philippine and U.S. governments, and also given the strategic, economic, as well as military interests of the United States in our country, we are afraid that the U.S. Might invoke the military alliance that it has with the New Zealand and Australian governments, so that your countries will be involved on our soil, like they did in the Vietnam War.
New Zealand's role has become that much clearer, even more sinister, with the development of the REEDY reaction force, which consists of about 1,000 to 1,200 military personnel who will have the backup of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, including their weaponry, which includes helicopters, skyhawks, support vessels, and even the involvement of 2 submarines is proposed. It will ensure that New Zealand acts as a kind of watchdog in the South Pacific. In fact, it ensures that we will be the spearhead of American foreign policy. Speaking from a purely moral point of view, the fact that there are Māoris in this ready reaction force makes it even less palatable. E ai ki tātou ki te Māori. Me he Māori kei roto I tēnei taua, kātahi te mea kino ko tēnā. Kei te patu tātou I a tātou, a rere ki oku whakaaro. Kaua tātou e whakauru ki roto I hene mahi kino, ki te patu I a tātou whanaunga, I roto I ngā mautere o te moana nui a kiwa. Upshot of all this is that once they've established the foothold in the countries, they maintain what is called civilian control. New Zealand is already involved in training our ready reaction force for this kind of role.
New Zealand government is helping us a lot in many ways so far, but looking at this reaction force, I don't think we would be happy with New Zealand government helping us with that. If all of us disagree with it, then that's where everybody should move together. Peace movement in the Pacific and in New Zealand, and particularly in Vanuatu, we could move together and try to put pressure on the governments who are involved in setting up this reaction force to put it off.
From the indigenous point of view, from the Māori people's point of view, New Zealand's role is one which has a historical significance. We are sick of fighting wars, from the First World War to the Second World War, to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and now the possibility of further wars, even nuclear wars in the Pacific area. The Māori people are no strangers to wars. Our people have fought for what they thought was the freedom of our country. For what? The only war that the people should be fighting, as far as I'm speaking on the Māori point of view, is back here in Aotearoa.
The Omega navigation station was proposed by the American Navy, and it was going to be built down by Lake Pearson. Now, the government tried to tell us that it would be really good for our merchant navy and for aeroplanes that got caught in storms and all sorts of other civilian purposes. But of course we discovered that because of the low frequency it couldn't be used for that, but it was ideal for submarine navigation. And so of course we got out and protested, and in Auckland over 2,000 students marched down the street. And it was massive, the teach-ins, the vigils, the work that we did. And as a result, they moved it, I think, over to Victoria in Australia somewhere. And there are even protests over there too, but I think you could say from a New Zealand point of view, we won that one. Project Longbank was a highly secret American military base, and at first we didn't know what its function was. It looked extremely sinister with igloos and radio masts everywhere, but what we found out was that it was being used to monitor the effects of nuclear explosions and what those effects would be on radar and radio transmission. So in the event of a nuclear war, it would be very useful information. So we marched, and it created terrific national interest. There was enormous tension before. We thought we were going to have to storm the base and there'd be a lot of trouble. When we got there, the police were waiting for us and handed us leaflets showing us where we could march and where we could camp. Beautiful campsite for 150 of us. And then the next day they opened up the base for the news media and any scientists that we wanted to put through it. And we couldn't believe the back down on the part of the government. So in actual fact, we opened it up and possibly negated a lot of its use as a result. We felt our protest was very effective. And again, well, I think they closed it down in about 1973. So it was another victory.
In the late 1960s, the United States Air Force decided to operate a network of worldwide satellite tracking stations. Mount John in the Mackenzie country was picked to be one of these, and in 1969 the observatory opened on Crown land sublet from the University of Canterbury for an annual rental of $1. The official designation at the time for the function of the observatory was to track space debris, space garbage. Its real purpose was that it was a space track program as part of the North American Aerospace Defence Command, NORAD. The Baker-Nunn camera here photographed quote-unquote enemy satellites continuously, sent that information back to NORAD headquarters situated under Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, and if it was deemed necessary in the event of war to shoot down these so-called enemy satellites, the targeting information provided from Mount John and other observatories in the network could be sent to Johnston Island in the Pacific, and from there nuclear-tipped missiles could be fired to shoot the satellites down. From the outset, there was intense suspicion within the student body at Canterbury that this was in fact a military installation. There was a lot of research done by numerous people. For example, Owen Wilkes established that it was. A concerted campaign was launched to drive Mount John out from under the academic cloak of respectability. This reached its climax in March 1972 with a national demonstration here of people from all around the country. We camped down at the foot of the hill here. On the Saturday night, a large number of people climbed up. We were confronted by rather aggressive police in the resulting melee. They let dogs loose on us. 2 people were bitten. One was bitten in the cock, one on the leg with serious injuries, and one schoolboy was kicked in the face by a dog handler and suffered a broken jaw. And the following day, we all came up the top here, incensed by what had happened the night before. There was a demonstration, and on the way back down the hill in a totally spontaneous outbreak of mass civil disobedience, we decided that we would both blockade the base and blockade the police at the top of the hill. They'd left all their cars up here. So we proceeded to lay our hands on all the thousands of boulders around, ranging up in size to several tons, dragged them onto the road and demolished anything else that came to hand. As a direct result of this demonstration and this campaign, the University of Canterbury decided it had enough. There was a doubt about the function of the base. Later that year, they decided not to renew the sublease, but then the Labor government, in one of its very first actions, stepped in and directly took over the lease to the United States Air Force. In 1975, the US Air Force stopped running Mount John directly and contracted the job out to the Bendix Corporation of America in the interest of more efficiency and of sanitising the operation for the benefit of the New Zealand government and people. And in 1983, it was announced that Mount John would be closed and relocated to Hawaii, where technologically superior facilities were available.
After the Mount John protests, the anti-base campaign turned its attention to Christchurch International Airport. where the United States Navy had the Operation Deep Freeze base. The campaign culminated with a national demonstration at Christchurch Airport in March 1973. Well, we were demonstrating against the military facilities which were operating at Harewood as distinct from the Operation Deep Freeze itself. In other words, we were demonstrating against the Naval Communications Unit and the US Air Force Military Airlift Command facilities, which we believe are there almost entirely for military reasons.
Move back, move back.
After the Mount John demonstration last year, we expected that the police were going to be reasonably militant about things, but this was a completely new experience. I don't think there's anything been like this in the South Island by the police ever. The police showed extreme skill and a very high degree of coordination in using large numbers of men marching with military precision. Their tactics when they were maintaining their blockades were extremely effective. Yeah, that wound that I got on my face was actually inflicted by Gideon Tate, the Commissioner of Police, who was personally masterminding the whole demonstration. The things that we were demonstrating against then, and what are still at Christchurch Airport, first of all there is the Naval Communications Unit, and this is a part of the United States Naval Telecommunications System. At Christchurch Airport it's divided into two parts. At the airport itself you have the receiver aerials. They're of two kinds. There's ones for listening to particular military bases, and there are omnidirectional ones for communicating with aircraft and ships. Within the communication centre itself there are fancy receivers, and at the time we were demonstrating there were KW-26 encrypting machines for putting all the messages into code. The transmitting station for the Naval Communications Unit is located a few miles outside Christchurch within RNZAF base Wedens, and there they have some quite fancy antennas and quite powerful transmitters. One of them is 40 kilowatts, which is a very big transmitter indeed. And they have antennas and frequency registrations for communicating with Hawaii, continental United States, Australia and other places, as well as Antarctica. So the capability of the transmitting station is far more than is needed simply for communicating with the Antarctic. And we know now that in the 1960s at least, it was actually serving as a backup to the high-frequency transmitters at the US Naval Communications Station at Northwest Cape in Australia. The United States Navy claims that it serves purely for communicating with Antarctica now, but we have documents, official US Navy documents as recent as 1979, which describe it as still being part of the Naval Telecommunications System. The Naval Communications Unit has continued to be a focus of protest. On two occasions someone has got in there and toppled antennas as a protest against visiting nuclear-powered warships. The other important thing at the Operation Deep Freeze base is the Military Airlift Command, or MAC. The Military Airlift Command is the outfit that flies the big transport planes all around the globe, carrying passengers and cargo to military bases everywhere. And in the event of a war or an invasion or anything like that, it's the Military Airlift Command planes that fly the troops into the crisis area. 2 or 3 MAC flights come in through Christchurch Airport every week, and over 50% of these flights have nothing whatever to do with Operation Deep Freeze itself. They're not carrying cargo for Antarctica. The flights are purely for military reasons. The planes involved are mostly the huge C-141 Starlifters. Generally the flights come from the continental United States through Hawaii. They pass through Christchurch to bases in Australia and then back through Guam to the US. We don't really know what kind of cargo the planes carry because New Zealand has waived all its rights to inspection. It's quite possible that they could carry anything in support of any kind of military activity. It's conceivable, although it's very unlikely, that they could carry nuclear weapons through New Zealand without the New Zealand government knowing.
It has
as I said, barracks for a number of individuals. It has a supply warehouse for both military and civilian equipping. There are also certain radio communications and satellite reception devices and dishes available in this vicinity. Part of that for meteorological uses, for development of weather maps and weather predictions for use in the Antarctic and flights to and from.
It is all in American hands. What does our independence mean under all this? Do you get a vote for the President of the United States? Where's your democracy? It doesn't mean a damn thing.
The transit circle facility being built here on top of Black Birch Mountain in sunny Marlborough will be operated when constructed by the United States Naval Observatory. Why the American military wants a site here is because they want to precisely map southern hemisphere stars. They want an observatory approximately 45 degrees south. There is already the Carter Observatory up here on this hill, and they wanted one in a country of a sympathetic ally with a stable government. In fact, the New Zealand government provides the land for this at a rental of $100 a year. And the official story for this installation is that it's all in the interest of pure science. This bullshit follows in the tradition of what the New Zealand public has been told with the functions of all American installations in New Zealand, Project Longbank at Blenheim, Mount John in the Mackenzie country, and Harewood in Christchurch. The true function, as spelled out in American military documents, is to, quote, provide the necessary increased accuracy necessary for military purposes, unquote.
It'll be measuring about 200,000 southern hemisphere stars which aren't visible from northern observatories. And there's lots of uses for this kind of data. It's used in ordinary civilian navigation, for example, but by far the most important use is that this star data will be incorporated in the guidance systems of the Trident missiles, which will be aboard Trident submarines cruising in the Pacific. The first one was launched in 1979, and at least 10 of the Trident submarines will be operating in the Pacific eventually. Each submarine will carry 24 Trident missiles, and each of those missiles carries 8 independently targetable warheads. So that's 192 cities that you can destroy with just one submarine. Trident missile gets way out into space in the middle of its trajectory, it brings into action a small telescope in the nose cone of the missile, which takes a fix on a particular star, and it actually navigates itself by reference to that star.
This is all part of a new an aggressive strategy which is called the counter-force first strike strategy, which targets Soviet missile silos, etc., rather than cities, and therefore exact targeting capabilities are required. If they can do it, and they can develop a first strike strategy, first strike capability strategy, that makes nuclear war all the more tempting, and it makes it all the more likely that it'll happen. And this piece of tranquil Marlborough countryside could in fact play a reasonably essential link in a chain that leads directly to World War III.
Intelligence gathering is incredibly important to the United States. It doesn't need to use weapons so long as it knows who's doing what where. Then it's in a position to exert pressure. And to this end it has a great array of intelligence gathering antennas and stations right around the world. And New Zealand merely fits into this huge pattern. And so we are being expected to monitor what's going on out in the Pacific and pass this back to the United States. And the way we do this in New Zealand specifically is via the station at Tangimoana, which is near Palmerston North. The heart of the Tangimoana installation is the circular array of 76 antennas. The circular array fixes the location of ships by cooperating with 2 other similar stations. We think that probably it's using one in Australia and another one in Guam, or maybe 2 in Australia. Once the information has been gathered by Tangimoana, it is then fed into the system around the Pacific, which the US is operating to gather intelligence. If the United States told us that a foreign ship, a potentially hostile warship, came into our maritime surveillance area, then we could be asked to go out and pinpoint the location of that ship exactly. There are 5 Orion aircraft which form number 5 Squadron based at Whenuapai, and they're making regular patrols throughout the Pacific. They're covering a huge area all the way to the equator and back again.
We are an island nation. We're surrounded by the ocean. We have huge ocean distances between us and our allies, and we have accepted a very important responsibility for surveying this part of the world.
When the Orion gets to the general area of a target vessel, it uses a combination of state-of-the-art radar, radio analysing gear and infrared detection to find the sub or the ship. Then they take photographs, up to 80 photographs per patrol. Some of these photographs go to the Joint Intelligence Organisation, which is near Canberra, and they're analysed there to identify and work out the role of the target vessel. When they're tracking submarines, they drop sonar buoys into the sea.
He might start off by dropping sonar buoys which just listen, and he'll drop them in a wide distributed pattern, and hopefully he'll pick up the noise from the electric motors or the nuclear generator of a submarine. So his main object in the end, of course, is to position the aircraft to be able to drop a weapon as close as possible to the submarine. In the anti-submarine environment, if you're on an exercise, there's little difference between pretending to drop a weapon and actually dropping the weapon.
Except that you don't perhaps kill people.
Yes, that doesn't really enter your mind. Even in a wartime situation, I suspect, all you would get would be a disappearing blip.
Over the years, there have been lots of research contracts from the United States Department of Defence fulfilled at New Zealand universities. At the present time, the University of Waikato has a contract from the United States Army, for example. The DSIR has also done quite a bit of military research, in particular the Physics and Engineering Laboratory. But the most important institution doing military research in New Zealand is the Defence Scientific Establishment, located in the Devonport Naval Base. Amongst other things, New Zealand scientists there have earned quite a reputation for expertise in the study of underwater sound. For this kind of work, the United States Navy has provided us with a research vessel, the TUI. Underwater sound is very important in the detection of submarines. The only way you can detect a submarine is by either bouncing a sound wave off it or listening to the noise that the submarine itself makes. This is very important in the arms race because at the moment nuclear missile submarines are thought to be relatively undetectable, and so it's very destabilizing, and this is one of the most important developments in first strike nuclear capability by the United States.
We feel that scientists should refuse to do work that is involved with weapons of mass destruction. That is, to refuse to do any research and development in chemical, biological or nuclear warfare. If scientists all over the world were to refuse to do this sort of work, then the arms race would come to a halt.
Fire mission! Fire mission! Enemy tank! Enemy tank! Right front! Right front! 1,600 meters! 1,600 meters! Fire when ready! Fire when ready!
Now we get to load it out and move it off Hawaii. So that's practicing a deployment, which is something we'll have to do. And then to get here where we have extensive training areas. We just don't have a Wairuru in the state of Hawaii.
Newly loaded by starting along the side rail. Locked in place by the bridge clamp. And armed with an arming device.
With the gradual withdrawal of Britain from the Pacific, we've turned more and more to the United States as a defence partner. We've ended up with a New Zealand military force which is tailor-made to serve United States military purposes rather than to defend our own country. Our Navy, for example, is ill-equipped for our own coastal defence, but is really just one more cog in the United States naval war machine.
That is our ANZUS lifeline. We're on board the New Zealand frigate Taranaki, 50 miles south of Norfolk Island, and about to make the American connection. Join us as we take close-up aboard the nuclear warship Truxtun.
The joint naval exercises have at least two psychological objectives. They condition the New Zealand public into accepting that we are part of a nuclear alliance and that our forces will get involved in nuclear wars, and they condition our military personnel to actually take part in a nuclear war. Perhaps our personnel, like our military equipment, are a little bit out of date in this, and they have to be brought up to date with the realities of the nuclear age, first strike strategies and all that sort of thing.
Did witnessing the explosions influence you regarding nuclear warfare?
Yes, I'm against it now. It scarcely seems fair. They lob one of those things at you and it's all over. It's a matter of who gets in first. I think it's really taken all the sportsmanship out of war. A bit disappointing, really.
Room at action stations.
Engage bogey 03 bearing 100. Policy aircraft to exercise provide HE2's VT. Set range 180, lookout bearing of policy aircraft.
Grand Slam, track 8006.
Both rails ready for launch, both Terriers. Fire, roger, birds away. Rails rearm, both Terriers.
This ship has nuclear propulsion, but much more importantly, it also has nuclear weapons. You can see on the deck there, there's a couple of launchers for ASROC missiles. These have a 1 kiloton warhead. There's also a couple of helicopters stashed underneath the fantail deck, and they can drop 10 kiloton nuclear depth charges. Now the government tells us that these are only your ordinary or garden variety of tactical nuclear weapon. We don't need to worry too much about them. But much more important is that this ship and a lot of others in the Pacific Fleet will soon be carrying the Tomahawk cruise missile. The Tomahawk is a long-range cruise missile. It'll go 2,500 kilometers, and it's got a very big warhead. It can have a 200 kiloton warhead, which is about 7 or 8 times as big as the Hiroshima bomb. And this is exactly the same cruise missile as everyone in Europe is getting upset about, and the Greenham Common Women are demonstrating about. And yet there's only 464 of them going into Europe, and there'll be something like 800 of them deployed on ships in the Pacific by the United States Navy.
A sleek, dark shape in the early morning on Wellington Harbour is the United States nuclear submarine Harewood, the first nuclear-powered vessel to visit New Zealand. The Minister of Defence, Mr. Connolly, visits Harewood with other ministers to see how the modern submariner lives. Submarines are now missile carriers. Sealed in its hangar, the Regulus can be transported underwater 600 miles a day and launched at targets 1,000 miles off. USS Harewood is the first nuclear submarine designed to launch guided missiles from the sea. The next development, undersea launching.
The origin of the nuclear-free zone idea in New Zealand goes back to 1962. At that time, we got the idea actually from Australia, from the then leader of the Australian opposition, who put forward a proposal not for a nuclear-free South Pacific, but for a nuclear-free Southern Hemisphere. And we thought that was a jolly good idea, and we picked it up and we used it in petitions and we used it on our marches in the early 1960s, and we called it our No Bombs South of the Line plea. In the early 1970s, the nuclear-free zone movement got an added impetus. I think a lot of the worry there was to do with the atmospheric tests that the French were conducting on Motuhake at that time, and a number of individuals decided that the way to approach this was to take a boat up to the testing area. That was a very powerful form of protest that involved the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and involved the Greenpeace organisation and some other independent groups as well. But then finally our own government took up the issue and they decided to send frigates across to the testing area as an official government protest.
We're a small nation, but we will not abjectly surrender to injustice. We shall continue to condemn and oppose the testing of nuclear weapons, whether by China, France, or any other nation, by every means properly open to us to use.
At that time, Fiji was in a very pivotal position to take the lead in the South Pacific. And we were actually playing a very progressive role in regional politics, together with the Australian and New Zealand governments, in promoting the idea of a nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific.
Our government took a resolution to the United Nations in conjunction with Fiji and Australia and got tremendous international support for the idea of a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone. 110 votes at the General Assembly and no nation opposing it. But we then had, unfortunately, a national government come into office.
After the election of the two conservative governments in Australia and New Zealand in 1975, the position changed. Fiji succumbed to pressure from the United States, France, and combined with the hostility of these conservative governments to the promotion of the idea of a nuclear-free zone in the Pacific Forum. Fiji now no longer takes the initiative.
We then started to see nuclear warships visiting our ports regularly, and we started to see a number of high-ranking American defence officials coming here to New Zealand, and at the same time tremendous publicity about the Soviet threat in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific.
There is a general consensus that the greatest threat to peace and stability in the area has been the growing aggressiveness of an encroachment of the Soviet Union into the area, both directly and through proxy.
We now know from American congressional documents that that threat was, inflated out of all proportion.
In Vietnam and Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang, the Soviet fleet is establishing a substantial base. So, that's not regarded as just a picnic or anything like that. That is a real 2,000-mile jump into the middle of our lines of communication.
The Soviet Union's nuclear submarines, armed with ballistic missiles and long-range torpedoes, and backed with missile-carrying planes and ships, are capable of destroying an enemy in any region of the world's oceans. Now, that, I think, is literally correct. There's only one power on Earth that can resist that aggression, and that's the power of the United States of America. And we must be thankful that in spite of the catastrophe of Vietnam, catastrophe caused by the unwillingness of the American administration to use their ultimate weapons.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I think it's very obvious, isn't it?
I'd like you to explain.
Well, look, I mean, you ask a silly question, you get a silly answer. You know what I mean. I think everyone else does.
You feel the Americans should have used nuclear weapons in Vietnam?
No, I don't. I didn't say that. But we are obviously talking about nuclear weapons. They did not use them.
In keeping with the standing Navy policy, we can neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons aboard any of our warships.
The purpose, we are told, for the American nuclear warship visits is so that the sailors on board can have rest and recreation. They come here well away from their normal strategic area of operations.
The warmth and the hospitality of the people of New Zealand is world-renowned, especially rumored in the United States Navy.
They seem to think that we're important to them, and I wonder sometimes whether the reason why we're important to them is because we give them a certain moral credibility for their nuclear strategy.
The time has come. Defend yourselves against nuclear death. Now together we are strong.
Take your ship and get out of this harbour. Get out of the South Pacific as well.
The time has come. Defend yourselves against nuclear death. Now together we are strong. You are most unwelcome here. Captain, please remove this circle. It is in a nuclear-free zone.
We are not going to be moved by them because we believe that they are misled. Genuinely concerned people, but misled.
We don't want no nuclear war. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want no nuclear war. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want no nuclear war. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want no nuclear war.
There's no good military reason for the ship coming right at this particular time. It's purely political. They're trying to break down the resistance of New Zealand and any other countries that don't want to have anything to do with this kind of ship. The ultimate reason is that the United States is seeking strategic dispersal for all its ships. They want to have as many ports around the world as possible that they can use in time of war to make it as difficult as possible for the Russians to knock them all off.
And capitalism for everyone else. Only 6% of the Pentagon contracts are
The real issue I submit to you is whether your Labour government is going to be prepared to welsh on the commitment it made in opposition, the way the Australian Labor government has done, now that it's government?
Well, I can tell you this, that I have absolutely no plan to do that. I have been the subject of much representation by interests from the United States and Australia in the run-up to the election and since the election. Not the slightest sign of that buckling has taken place as far as I am concerned. It is basic to our policy. It is in the interest of New Zealand's security, and it is something which our friends will themselves accommodate to.
Only a hand clasp that separates our countries. And in the hand, equipment to speak the only kind of language that can answer terrorism.
We in the Philippines are afraid that your countries will be involved on our soil like they did in the Vietnam War.
Catastrophe caused by the unwillingness of the American administration to use their ultimate weapons.
And this piece of tranquil Marlborough countryside could in fact play a reasonably essential link in a chain that leads directly to World War III.
Even in a wartime situation, I suspect, all you would get would be a disappearing blip.
You get a vote for the President of the United States. Where's your democracy?
All I want to do is not only to be the possessor of freedom and liberty, but I want to be the protector of it, not just for myself, but for mankind.
We are the custodians of the Maori, the vital life principle, if you like, of this great expanse of ocean, what they call the Pacific, and New Zealand itself. And we will not be able to preserve that Maori by involving ourselves in wars and more wars outside the shores of Aotearoa. Ka ti konei, koe nei taku whakaro kia tata. Hei aha te take pakanga ki ngā whenua ke, kei konei te oranga mo tātou, me hoki mai tātou ki te tieki, ki te manaki, te Maori o tō tātou e whenua. Me te hāpai i ngā tikanga e pāna kia tāu ki te Māori, e noho nei i rungo i te mato te whenua nei o Aotearoa.